Okay. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for choosing to spend your time with us tonight. I know our snowless evenings are numbered, so we're thrilled you decided to log in to us tonight instead of enjoying some time outside. I think we're hitting high teens later in the week, though, so don't worry, you've still got a little bit left. Um, Before we get going tonight, it's important for the Jewish Heritage Center of Western Canada to acknowledge that the province of Manitoba is located on the territories of Treaties 1 through 5 and on the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the national homeland of the Red River Métis. We respect and honor the treaties and agreements that were made on these lands we share, and we remain committed to strengthening our relationships with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Harlan Abels, and I am the Vice President of the Jewish Heritage Center of Western Canada, an organization that I've been extremely fortunate to be part of for the better part of the past almost 4 years. The Jewish Heritage Center serves to develop, interpret, and disseminate information on the history and culture of Western Canadian Jewry, and to develop awareness of the history, moral, and ethical implications of the Holocaust and other human rights violations. We maintain a vast archive of physical and digital artifacts, documents, and photographs that reflect and preserve the history of our community. We provide programming throughout the year on a wide variety of topics. As well, we provide education on the Holocaust and anti-Semitism to thousands of Manitoba students and educators every year. The Marion and Ed Vicker Jewish Museum of Western Canada is a visually dynamic environment offering viewers in-depth information about topics and ideas integral to the understanding of our community. The recently refurbished Freeman Family Foundation Holocaust Center displays artifacts donated by local survivors and their families. If you haven't had the chance to check out the space since the renovations, I'd highly recommend doing so. And if you're looking to get involved specifically with us or within the community in general, please feel free to reach out to either myself, our president, Mark Cantor, executive director, Bel Janevsky, or anyone else you might hear from on this call, and we'd be happy to find a place for you. The Switzer-Cooperstock Prize at the Jewish Foundation of Manitoba was established by the Switzer family to honor the memory of their parents and grandparents. Tonight, we're here to listen to this year's award winner, Celia Rabinovitch. I think I got that right. Sorry, Celia, if I mispronounced it. Deliver a lecture titled The List Expressionist Nick Udell, a Photographer Discovered. Thank you again for joining us tonight. You guys are in for a treat, and I'll pass it off to Stan Carbone to speak more to the night that we have in store for you. Go ahead, Stan.
Thank you, Harlan. Good evening. My name is Stan Carbone. I'm Director of Programs and Exhibits with the Jewish Heritage Center of Western Canada. I would like to welcome you to the 2024 Switzer-Cooperstock Prize talk in Western Canadian Jewish history, which was established, as Harlan has indicated, by the Switzer family in honor of their parents and grandparents, and specifically Louis Switzer, Rose Switzer, nee Cooperstock. The prize is awarded for a publishable essay on Jewish history in Western Canada, with some preference for essays on Jewish secular schools in Western Canada, Jewish settlers, farmers, and traders in rural Western Canada, and the immigration experience of Jews to Western Canada. Over the years, prize monies have gone to a wonderful and eclectic range of historical topics that, pieced together, have really greatly augmented our understanding of Western Canadian Jewish history and culture. This evening, the Switzer family is represented by Paul Switzer. Paul, we of the Jewish Heritage Center thank you and your family for this altruistic and visionary gesture. Thank you for honoring us with your presence. And now I'd like to invite you to say a few words.
Thank you, Stan. Yeah, it's certainly a pleasure for me once again to hear the speaker that the Jewish History Center of Western Canada has selected for this year's prize winner. And also in particular, it'll be an opportunity for me, was an opportunity for me to look a little bit into the work that Celia Rabinovitch has done. And I'm very impressed. I think we're in for a treat today. As you can see behind me is a photograph of my parents, Louis Switzer and Rose Cooperstock Switzer. They met in Winnipeg. They both were immigrants to Winnipeg, and My dad immigrated Switzer family immigrated in the 1920s, and the Cooperstock family immigrated about a decade earlier. As I said, it's a pleasure. My dad, Louis Switzer, for many years, worked at the Dominion Electric Company, where he eked out a fairly modest living, but managed nevertheless to provide the needs in wonderful fashion for his kids, me and my brother Fred Switzer, who is with us today. And my mom, Rose Cooperstock Switzer, spent some time on a farm in Lorette, Manitoba, and later worked at Gunn's Bakery in Winnipeg for many years. So this series of lectures, again, is to honor their memory specifically. Stan, I can give this over now. Who goes next? There we go.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you kindly again for your support of our organization, which, as I've indicated, this has given us the opportunity to do all kinds of interesting projects, and we've had the opportunity to over the years to present a whole range of topics that cover very important aspects of the history of this community, not only the Winnipeg community, but beyond. This year, the Switzer-Cooperstock Prize has been given to artist and author Celia Rabinovitch for her paper, The Lost Expressionist, Nick Udall, a Photographer Discovered. A youth who began taking photographs in Morden when he was only 12 in 1928, boldly experimenting with his camera in the emerging field of fine art photographer, Nick Udall photographed the people of the 1930s in Western Canada, creating dramatic portraits, documenting the lives of friends and colleagues in the rural, ethnic, urban, and Jewish communities of the Canadian West. Enlisting in 1940, he perished a Canadian war hero when his RAF bomber encountered German flak over Tunisia in 1943, leaving an extensive archive of over 300 negatives. Celia discusses the life and work of Nick Udall through the discovery of Nick's archive of photographs and describes how she researched his life through his photographs, letters, oral histories, and research. She offers reflections on Nick's images that provide insight into the gritty, playful, and perilous era in which he lived, revealing a vibrant world in Manitoba from the Jazz Age through the Great Depression and the advent of the Second World War. A bit about Celia Rabinovitch. Celia is an artist, writer, and scholar, weaves the artist's experience into an understanding of modern art, history, cultural anthropology, and history of religions. Her paintings are exhibited in Canada, Europe, and the United States, most recently in Ibiza, Spain, in the exhibition Through the Mirror of Magic. She has led programs and taught at the University of California at Berkeley, the University of Manitoba, Syracuse University, the University of Colorado, the California College of the Arts, and the San Francisco Art Institute. And she has been invited speaker at the Cornell University Art Museum, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, Boca Raton Museum of Art, the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, and University of the Arts in Philadelphia, among others. She was awarded the John A. Sproul Fellowship in Canadian Studies, Fine Arts, and Anthropology, UC Berkeley, for her work on the theme of tonight's presentation, The Recovery of the Work of Nick Udall. She is also the author of two books, the influential Surrealism and the Sacred, Power, Eros, and the Occult in Modern Art, and Duchamp's Pipe, a chess romance, Marcel Duchamp and George Koltanowski, which was nominated for the 2021 Vine Award in Canadian Jewish Literature and History. Currently, she is special advisor and contributing author of 10 linked biographies of modern artists and writers for the Israel Museum for a book about Arturo Schwartz, the surrealist poet, collector, and donor. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Celia Rabinovitch.
Good evening. Thank you very much for being here. First, I want to offer thanks to the Switzer family, especially for establishing this award and for recognizing the work of various artists and scholars. Also, I want to thank the Jewish Heritage Center of Western Canada for all the work they do, including this particular award, and also the Jewish Federation. And I want to thank all the attendees for this talk. I look forward to a lively discussion afterwards. Now I want to share screen, and we're going to have the sound on as well. Greg?
Yeah, I'll make sure it comes through over here. Okay.
Okay, so I'm clicking the share screen, but I'm not getting, oh, there it is. Okay, here we go. Okay. Tonight, I'm going to discuss a project, longstanding project, about an unknown photographer and young Canadian Jewish artist and an enlistee and an RAF pilot who was a Canadian war hero. His name was Nick Udell. The project is The Lost Expressionist Nick Udell, a photographer discovered. He was someone who had a very rich life. He explored a lot of ideas in his photography, created nearly 100 years ago. He started taking photographs in 1928, and the photographs that we have available end about 1940, although apparently he did take photographs while he was an RAF officer, but have not been able to trace those. So this is an expressive project rather than a discursive one. We're going to enter Nick's life and Nick's world. And here he is at the age of 15 on the steps of St. John's High School, very proud with his new camera, which he's had for maybe a year or two. And he's posed the shot himself. He's had someone else shoot it. And you can see his sheer delight in having this camera as the vehicle for his self-expression. This is the box from where all the images came. Nick, when he left for World War II, left the box in Morden, Manitoba with my father, Milton Rabinovitch. And when I was 19, my father showed me the box. I had just learned about Nick from some of his movies. And he said, "These were Nick's. Do you think you could do anything with them?" And I looked at one, and it was a landscape, and they were negatives, and I didn't print in the darkroom, and I put it away, and I closed the box. And it wasn't until some years later that I thought, it's time to look at these. And so I began scanning them, and an entire world appeared, a world about which I was somewhat familiar, having been born in rural Manitoba in Morden, but also a world which I hadn't known existed in the 1930s. I'd only heard a few stories about it, and so it opened this world. So I'll just read you a brief passage from the beginning of this book about the gray box. Whoever opens this box opens a world, one that doesn't exist anymore, but that is brought to life through Nick Udell's images. Imagine opening a box of negatives shot before World War II by a young man from Morden, Manitoba, who perished during that war. No one has seen these negatives since the enlistee closed the wooden box that he made for his life's work in August 1940. He left for Camp Shiloh, Manitoba, and then Lethbridge, Alberta, to fly with the RAF, which later became the RCAF, to defend freedom. Enclosed is an unseen world captured by a young Canadian Jewish photographer from rural Manitoba during the Dirty 30s. His images express a vivid modern vision. The photographer was Isidore Nick Udell, 1916 to 1943, who perished in North Africa during World War II. His photographs span the Jazz Age and the Great Depression. He anticipated avant-garde art with dramatic portraits, double exposures, and experimental lighting. And he investigated other themes such as self-portraits, play, and place. I'll be giving you a brief summary of these, but also I won't be able to identify each person in the picture. Those are listed on the slides, but those would become linked short stories on their own. So I'm going to just pick up the salient themes and express what I think he was trying to say with these things. His family history bears a short view here, although it's very, very interesting. That's his father on your left. It's Alexander Ulevitz. This was from a postcard that he sent to his about-to-be fiancée, Nettie Kluner, in Kiev. They were both born in Kiev, according to records. In this, he carries his cornet. He's wearing a holster and a saber. These were accoutrements of a higher officer than just a regular infantryman or soldier, showing he attained some status in the Russian army. As well, the background, which was done in a studio in Vitebsk, appears to be a bit Asian, and that may be a reference to the fact that he was stationed in Vladivostok at the far eastern reaches of the Russian Empire. He was likely in part of an effort to secure the port of Port Arthur on the eastern edges of the Russian Empire, and therefore to bring the Trans-Siberian Railway through Manchuria. At the right, we see the Union Station around 1908. This is where Nick's parents would have arrived in Winnipeg after being in New York for some time. This is the back of the postcard. You can see it was done by an art photographer. It has a palette and an easel on it. And on it, Alex has inscribed, "You are in my mind all the time. Your image stays with me. I think of you always, and one day you will be my fiance and my bride. Love always, Alexander Ulevitz." This was to Nettie, or Sophie, his girlfriend in Kiev. And in the background, you can see here are some of the photographs that I also found, which my father had put in a Sandfield underwear box. Then also the gray box with the numbered envelopes. And on the right, my father, about the age that he was 19 or 20 with his new Essex automobile. And it's about the age he was when he started working with Nick. He was taking moving images, making films, and Nick was doing still photography. And they often worked on these projects together, projects that they invented themselves as a mode of self-expression and to document the daily life of the town. In the box, you'll see there's a number of additional envelopes because Nick intended to pursue photography when he returned from World War II. This is the 1916 census, which in the top bar shows the Ulevitz family living on Dufferin Avenue. And at the lowest line, you'll see Nick is listed as 7.5. That's 7.5 months old because he was born in 1916, the year of the census. The parents came over in 1909. As it notes, they had become by then Canadian citizens. Their national identity is marked as Russia, Kiev, which was also the Ukraine. And on the right-hand side, they're noted as either Hebrew or Jewish. Nick's mother died when he was 2 years old in 1918. And after some time, maybe a year or so, Alex found that he could not run a company, which he had, the Star Trading Company. They dealt with sugar because he'd made contacts in the sugar and sweet business when he was in Cuba on his way to New York to meet Nettie. He married Nettie around 1903. So here, what he thought was that he really couldn't look after this child, run a business, and have two school-age children. So he brought Nick to live with his maternal aunt, Sonia Kluner, who had married Doc Rabinovitch, my grandfather. And she became Nick's other mother. On the left-hand side, you'll see Doc Rabinovitch in front of his store on Railway Street in Morden around 1893. And if it looks like the store in Deadwood, it was like that. It had a big McCoskey account register. People congregated there for conversation, particularly on Saturday nights if it was kept open for the farmers. And it was a real establishment in the town. In the background in the center, you'll see a few horses tethered there. In the middle, you'll see young Nicky now living with the Rabinovitch family and 7 other children who are all Sonia's children. Behind him is Sonia, and to the right is Milton Rabinovitch. At the bottom, you'll see she's identified as Mama, Sonia, and with her Isidore or Nick, and then the other children, such as Leon on the left and some other family members. On the right is my father, just a few years after Nick, on his bicycle, a few years after Nick came to live with them. He was particularly close to my father, and he later worked in the store with him. And I can tell who did what because their handwriting was different, and those were all in the account ledgers from the store, which my grandfather and then later my father kept. It's a document from 1910. One of Nick's first themes was self-portraits, and this is a very unusual theme for someone doing photography at that time. And you would normally only see this in European photography, particularly of the avant-garde type. And he seems to have arrived at this on his own. In his self-portraits, he explores who he is and different moods that he has, and he tries on different personas by taking on different attitudes. So they form a record of his changing self, both as the actor and the form explored in his images. These are remarkably different from today's selfie, which is rather plastic and doesn't have a sense of authenticity. So even though at times Nick tries to glamorize himself, we don't get the sense that he is at all trying to be someone else. He's expressing different parts of himself. So this one is from 1934, and he's looking upward very aspirationally, and he's played with the form of the curtain against his profile to create a large design in the photograph. It's very innovative. He's also wearing menswear clothing, likely from the Rabinovitch store in Morden. He was a snappy dresser, and he liked to appear often more mature than he was, although I think boys and women at that time had to be mature because they were taking on adult roles in their teens. This is a very different mood in this self-portrait. In this, it's done in 1933, so he's 17, but it's extremely foreshortened, very similar to German expressionist photography. The background is dark. He's framed by his hands and the white collar, yet he's looking away in a kind of reflective moment. It's a very withdrawn image, and by all accounts, the interviews I did with people who knew him suggest that he was a withdrawn person. He was very shy. He was extremely intelligent, and he loved reading about science as well as photography, but he wasn't someone you could know easily. He was someone who was there, but these are the way we know him, through his photographs. So this is really a visual journey through his entire life. At the left, he's on the top of a chicken coop ventilator. This is a delightful image. It reminds me of Henri Cartier-Bresson or L'Artigue, French photographers from around the turn of the century or the 1930s and 40s. It's an expression of pure joy, and it likely was taken once he graduated from St. John's Technical College in Winnipeg. The right is a photograph in the Udell residence on Alfred Avenue, and here he's depicted himself as a mature young man. By now he's 18, but he's using cast shadow in a very innovative way. He must have been familiar with, to a degree, either film noir or some portrait photography or some history of art, because he uses Caravaggio-esque lighting techniques to make the form emerge. So obviously he explored a lot of different ways to make photographs, showing how creative and investigative he was, even at a time when there were very few resources. Remember, this is 1934. Books and magazines would have been hard to come by. Yes, there were libraries, but things weren't as accessible as they are today. So he must have really had to pursue things to get this kind of knowledge. There was another thing I wanted to mention, is that Nick had 2 families, because Although he lived with the Rabinovitch family in Morden and referred to my grandmother Sonia as Mama, he also lived with his father and his two siblings, Milton and Mary, in Winnipeg. He went to McCrae High School and St. John's Technical College, so he had an experience of both places, both urban and rural, both going up and back. And there were railways that ran up and back in Manitoba, north and south, as well as east and west, or he could ride with family members. So he really had an experience of two different worlds. And that stayed with him, the sense of adventure. He became kind of peripatetic in his imagination and his ability to want to see other places. At the left, we have a very film noir photograph, and he's only 18 here, but he's made himself look somewhat like a gangster or a character from a movie in the 1930s with extreme light and shade and foreshortening as he leans back in a kind of sinister shadow to the right of his figure. And on the right is a much more straightforward self-portrait from 1935. So he would have been 19 then, and he's wearing a good suit and looking at us in a very straightforward way. So you get the sense of someone without a lot of pretense, but who's kind of deep and somewhat withdrawn in his work. This is his last self-portrait, shot while he was on leave before going to training. And this is one which I've looked at a lot because it's perplexing in the way that it's less positive than the other photographs. He seems to be somewhat worried or concerned. He looks a bit fatigued. Perhaps he's very concerned about his departure for Europe, or he's seeing himself more as an adult. This is about 1939, 1940. So he's already 23. He's become a different person. Now I want to show you a bit about the context in which Nick grew up. And to do this, I'm going to use some archival films which were shot by my father from 1931 on. And you'll see that either Nick shot the images, and sometimes they're too high, so you only see the heads of people or the tops of their heads, or my father shot them. So the second part of this little short video shows Nick playing dice with some workers, probably at the back of the Rabinovitch family store, and then it shows some family. It begins with my father and a friend skating. So I just want to give you a sense of the context of the town. And there is a little car scene in it as well. So, oh, sorry. Okay, there it is.
Celia, if there's audio for these, it's not coming through.
Oh, it isn't?
No.
Why isn't it? Oh,
I think you'd have to share your screen again and select the share sound
there.
option.
Well, maybe we won't because I'd have to stop it for the audience, right?
Okay, that's no problem.
Right. But there is audio for the rest, so maybe we'll take a break in the middle. And that's Nick playing dice with some workers likely behind the family store. This is 1933, 34. These are family members, just introducing part of the cast and characters. So, we're going to go. Now I'm going to move on to another theme, which is that of portraits. Nick did a lot of portraits. He wanted to be a portrait photographer, and he tried different techniques in creating these. And they are portraits both of figures from his family, from the larger Jewish community that he met when he was in high school and at St. John's Technical Collegiate, and also of farmers, rural types, all different kinds of people. So they form an entire visual archive of a community, Morden and also Winnipeg, during the 1930s. This is a portrait from 1931. It's Beryl Rabinovitch, but it's shot in a backyard. So I just want you to note the contrast of her fur-lined capelet and the gown, as well as the very rough March landscape that he shot her. And it's a kind of wonderful contrast between glamour and grit, as I like to say, or it's very playful at the same time, it's somewhat serious. This is a portrait of his elder cousin, Ruby, who left Morden in 1928 to become a writer in New York at the and work with the Algonquin Club. But in this is very unlike the studio portraits of the time, because she's touching her hat casually. It's a windy day, and she's just exactly herself. She seems very authentic. She's gazing at him. It's an outdoor photograph. Most of them, other people would have done indoor studio photographs. So it's a very fresh way to look at his family and his colleagues. This is Sylvia Rosenberg. This is in Winnipeg. And I find this to be a very unusual photograph because the figure is very central, which is not typical for studio photographs. He's tried to show this young girl as she is. He's focused on details of her clothing and hands. And it's given us a very moving portrait of someone who's rather quiet and withdrawn. This is a woman from Rose du Lac. So one of the things that Nick did, this is in the 1930s, he would go to deliver goods to different small towns in southwestern Manitoba. So he was able to meet people there and become friends with them and work with them. So he often photographed them. So we have photographs from towns like Carman, Rose du Lac, different areas, Altona, areas like that, all the way into Saskatchewan. So it's also part of this archive, this small world that Nick opens up for us. And this you can see, this is a woman who maybe had some wealth before. She's wearing a fur jacket, but her shoes and stockings seem a little rough. So it gives a sense of what life was like in the Depression. People kept their clothes and things for a long time, and they posed as themselves. They're not trying to be someone else. So it's very different than today's glamorized photography. However, there are people like Beryl Rabinovitch, who was a Betty Davis lookalike, and she took on poses of the movie stars themselves. In fact, everyone in the family did that. So what does that tell us? It tells us that people were watching films that came to town, and particularly film noir, even pre-code films, where you'd have Jimmy Cagney or Betty Davis in these dramatic movies, or even Cary Grant, and they all learned the posture and gesture of the people in the movies. So you'll note that their attitudes and their poses are very different from what we see today, and it's because of the visual language of posture and gesture was different then. The same with the clothing. There's much more emphasis on clothing as a kind of accoutrement of character in these. So this is quite a stunning horizontal portrait with an expressive use of shadow in the background, an expressive use of light and dark. And he uses the white of her collar to highlight her face and bring us to different points of focus in the image. This is Wolf Rabinovitch, an older cousin, about whom my brother David Rabinovitch, I'm sure Dave is listening here, has written a book called Jukebox Empire. But this is Wolf Rabinovitch prior to 1928, either right before he left for Chicago or on a break when he came back to Morden. And in it, you can see what an innovative use of the camera at that time. Look at the angles that he creates with the lines of the telephone wires and the extreme light and shade, as well as Wolf scaling this telephone pole in a sort of stunt-like pose that was very common in the 1920s, and looking down on us in his formal menswear. But he's looking at us as if to say, gravity doesn't apply to me. I'm just simply beyond the rules, which in fact, that was part of his character. But it's an amazing image for someone who was only 12. And it tells us a lot about the kind of freewheeling quality that people had living out in the country. It allowed them to play more, I think. And that was an aspect not just of the Jewish community, but of the entire community. And they all got into doing photography with Nick. So they're all in his photographs, which is another remarkable thing because it's the only, I think, one of the only visual archives of life in the 1930s in Western Canada that shows the daily life of people. This is a man, Earl Gildemaster, who had gone to school with Nick at St. John's Tech. And we have some images where they experimented with light. But in this case, it's a fantastic portrait of this young man who's very serious. It's a year after they both graduated. And he gazes at us with a great deal of intelligence. You can see his eyes looking directly at us through the glasses. His hands are just touching his leather bomber jacket in the lower right of the painting, and Nick's used a pillow to frame his head and bring the light forward. So it's a very painterly and strong portrait of another young man. And there's no pretense in the clothing or anything like that. He's just shot them as they are. So there's a real sense of authenticity. These two young women, Fritzie Green and Shirley Walsh here, show that they have their own agency. They're smoking cigarettes, they're looking cockily or sassily at Nick. One, Fritzie Green, is wearing workwear, so she likely worked in a factory. And they both have their own sense of agency, their own sense of power, which you can also see in the portrait on the right of Shirley Walsh with the strong lights and darks that are available. And the way he's played with those lights and darks to highlight her eyes. And the composition is very carefully defined in thirds with the dark curtain and the lighter curtain behind her. So they're really kind of remarkable for someone who was just doing photography on his own and didn't have any formal training. Again, two portraits that have a very different approach. These are of his sister Mary, but Mary here is seen with strong light and shade. Again, a very painterly approach. And in the one on the right, it seems to forecast Andrew Wyeth's painting Christina's Field, but it is in fact his sister sitting in a field. And the lighting in it is quite different because it's side lighting from both sides to give her a sense of volume. But they're very remarkable portraits. This one shows a touch of romance. I think Nick was quite taken with this young woman, Etta Granovsky. In the photograph at the right, the curtains mimic the curls in her hair. So he's creating visual puns, which is, very sophisticated for an artist to do that. And then on the right, a photograph of them together, looking very, delighted with each other, very happy. And it's a very natural photograph. So he had many women friends as well as family members, and he just had a very broad view of life, and he was curious about everyone. Here's some friends from Morden. He's flanked by two women and Noreen McCorkindale. I'm sure some people from Morden are watching. Nick is in the middle, and he's in the Atchison residence. And again, he uses the pillows as a pictorial device to frame their faces. It's a formal portrait. It might have taken a minute or so to create the exposure. But at the same time, there's a sense of directness and naturalness in the people that gives us a sense of what their lives were like. This portrait at the left shows of Zenon Yonker. His name is below Nick's in the Canadian memorial book for soldiers who died in World War II. But in this one, he uses extreme angles to focus up towards Zenon's head. And it's a very expressionistic photo, very inventive. Whereas at the right, he's depicted This is the head of the nurses union, and he's depicted her with her dog. But the dog is given equal status to the human. And I find that to be very charming and very a kind of affection for animals that appears in these photographs that likely came from his rural background, because people were always working with animals. Like another thing that you'll notice is that in the films and some of the portraits and group photographs he did, there's a lot of roughhousing between people. People were much more physical with each other, and it wasn't given that kind of evaluative view that we give the sense of touch now. There was a lot more kind of touching and playing around that seemed to be part of play in the culture at the time. This is following on the animal theme. You can see that Nick gave animals the same status as humans. This is a portrait of Joe Beaudry's dog Donald on the right, and he's got that Labrador waiting for the next command intelligently in the photo. And on the left-hand side, two women, Isabel Peterson and another woman whose feather is very amusing in the hat, and the dog is identified as Snooks. So all the animals are identified as well as the humans, and I find that to be a very charming and sensitive view of life that appears in the photographs. Another thing that Nick explored in the themes that he looked at was that of children. Since he was planning, as his RAF attestation papers say, he was planning to open his own photography studio when he got back from World War II. He also took to photographing children, but he monumentalizes them, as in the photograph of the baby in the lake at the right. To do this, he had to get in the water and shoot from below, which would have been very tricky with the types of cameras you had then. And he captures the baby fascinated with the light glinting off the water and isolated, so they become very monumental. The same with the photograph at the left, where Mary Ginsburg is seen with her child at the lake, and it's just a really remarkable photo. He's allowed the figures to exist in a Western landscape, a Western lake, in a very simple way. And that's very unusual for the time. So I think that simplicity, that direct vision, is a particularly Western trait in the photographs. This is a photograph of Bert Deans, who was also enlisted and was became part of the forces in World War II. This is done just prior to the war. And in this case, Nick has monumentalized him again. He's seen silhouetted against the sun. It's a very striking photograph. And later he became the town milkman. But at the same time, what Nick did with his photographs is he made the town of Morden into a kind of legendary place where all of these people had their roles, and they were maybe larger than life roles because of the isolation of the town and the fact that there weren't too many people to keep track of. So I think living at that time, maybe there were 2,000 people in Morden. A lot of people would have known each other. They would have known of their establishments. And he was able to kind of document that sense of itself that a rural community had. By then, I should say by 1922, the synagogue in Morden had closed. So if they had services, they had family services at home on Friday nights or for Jewish holidays, but they weren't held in the synagogue anymore. And the menorah, which is the insignia for the Jewish Heritage Center of Western Canada, is the menorah my father preserved from Beth Ezra synagogue that he kept since 1922. Now, the next theme that Nick got into was a theme of play or leisure. And this tells us a lot what people did to entertain themselves at the time. He photographed people as wise guys, gangsters, glamorous seductresses, or rural character types. But this was actually what they were. They were either playing a role or that's actually who they were. But at the same time, there's a very dramatic background going on of the Depression and the rise of fascism in Europe, which they would have read about in the papers, as well as less information, mainly coming through the radio or newspapers. And at the same time, the fantasy escape in pulp fiction, which you can see that he was reading a lot of science fiction, and just a whole range of leisure that we actually don't even have the time for now. What did they do for leisure? They read books, they play acted, they did dress up, and they followed the movies, and they listened to radio, or they played music. So we'll see that in all these images. So just to bring this a little, let's see. So here's a little movie, again, showing what they were doing as for play, just to give you the context. So you get this, that was shot by Nick because the heads are cropped off. They were both very tall. Both he and my father were tall men. This image now is that of a party in the nurse's residence. The head nurse, who we see at the right, was supposed to be very serious and kept the nurses in line. But here she's seen in a clown costume in a very bizarre, almost fantasy photograph. She would have had to blow the noisemaker at exactly the time that Nick took that photograph. This all had to be timed very carefully. So it's an interesting use of photography and an interesting use of people play acting as other people. And just think, you could use the same costume in multiple ways. So things were accessible to people to have fun with very little materials, At the left, we see a group photo of the same party in the nurses' union and two noisemakers being blown, which would have had to be done at the same time. I think here he played with the symmetry to make a very a strange photograph. It's kind of has a primitive quality or an archaic quality to it, because often figures are placed off center in photographs. Reading, as I mentioned, was a very powerful way to relax in the Depression. And here we have Vera Steele reading. This is in Winnipeg. Now you'll note that little tapestry in the middle. That appears in a number of Nick's photographs. So it's obvious that he took it from one photograph to another. He had props, and he often has pictures of faraway scenes in his images, as if to say, that person's thinking of somewhere else. That person wants to go somewhere else. And I really think when he was doing that, he was suggesting that he was the one who wanted to go somewhere else. So he had this sense of adventure or curiosity about the rest of the world. So despite the relaxation, there's something else going on in this photograph. I can't show you all of the images that he did that in, but many are in his self-portraits, where he has a painting in the background. And in the French call that mode d'emploi, or instructions for use, which means it tells us what the photograph is about, or what the painting is about. It's a painting within a painting, or an image within an image. That's a kind of key to the rest of the image. You find that in his work, and that makes it, I think, very intriguing. And I think he must have been conscious of it, or he wouldn't have set it up that way. Again, play acting. This is Nick at the right, dressed as a kind of Bonnie and Clyde gangster, but he's using his friend's rifle. Vic Burgess at the left, and that's Vic, and again, his dog identified as Pag. Remember, they have equal status to people. Very sympathetic with animals, but it's southwest of Morden, out in the country, and two different depicting themselves as two different character types. So again, imagining oneself as someone else is a kind of form of leisure. Visual humor formed a huge part of Nick's catalog of images. This is just one example of two people in a large pair of pants, probably taken from the Rabinovitch family store, or by then my father's store. And it's Edith Dickey and Cliff Milne behind the Burgesses store. The Burgesses were a bakery, and two different views of them, but it's meant to be fun and funny. And you can imagine the time they spent getting into this outfit and getting dressed up and laughing the whole time. So there's a real element of a innocent silliness in the work, which I find incredibly fresh and charming. This is a couple that he was friends with in Carmen. You'll note this is shot from below, and I think they must have had a couple of shots beforehand. Everything's off kilter. There's lots of pattern, polka dots, stripes of the pillow. She appears to be wearing the lampshade, which may be an in-joke on Nick's part. But it's a really fun image and shot in an unusual way for that time period. And then we find Nick in the same setting, but he's reading a book. And the book, when I blew that up, because you have to be a bit forensic and investigate this, the book is called The Green Rust. And it's by a science fiction writer who was very popular, Edgar Wallace, in the 1920s. And the book, The Green Rust, was about a mad scientist who creates a biohazard that's going to destroy all the corn crops in the world. Now, southwestern Manitoba, we know, is an agricultural region, and there were a number of Jewish farmers among the farmer population, and this would have been of great concern to them because I think they took some of these science fiction ideas very seriously, and they could imagine the potential of things that we confront today, like biohazards or biological warfare, because that's what that book was about. You can still buy his books on eBay. They're kind of rare, old, pulp fiction books. At the left, we can see some of the magazines he was reading because my father preserved all of his materials that he had collected. So I have all of the magazines he read from the first issues of Popular Photography on. So there's Minicam, Popular Photography, that are exploring different ways of doing photography. Now, popular photography didn't start until 1937, but look at the innovative work that he was doing prior to 1937. I mean, that's really remarkable. He played with these ideas on his own. And I think it shows a high degree of curiosity that he shared with other members of my father's family who were interested, say, in agriculture or other innovations that could help the human race. Now I want to go to the theme of place, which is in his work. With regard to place, Nick documented events and scenes in Morden and Winnipeg and areas in southwestern Manitoba. This is an image of my father, Milton Rabinovitch, against I think it's the window of his store. It's a double exposure, but that creates a very moody image. And Nick traveled around, as I mentioned. He moved up and back between Morden and Winnipeg. He went around to the small towns to deliver goods. So while he was working as a clerk in the store from 1933 to 39, he also did photography, which documented the life of the town and the life of the people in these different communities. So his sense of adventure comes through when he documents place. This is the Morden Dam in the park when it's under construction. It's a very beautiful photo, but he does capture these little moments like the small boy in the lower left and the other child leaning over the part of the platform that's being built. And it's a fall day, obviously, or an early spring, there's no leaves on the tree. So it's a moody image. He doesn't try to glamorize it. Here again, another horizontal image, two figures at the experimental farm, the Dominion Experimental Farm in Morden. This forms an important part of Nick's history, but I didn't get into it in this talk so much due to time. But both he and my father worked at the experimental farm to develop new crops to feed the world. And it was a very rare place in that it was one of the few of these experimental farms in Canada that also dealt with horticulture and animal husbandry. It was established in 1916. And at this time in the 30s, they were still investigating different kinds of crops. They would invite people once a year to come from Winnipeg to come and sample the fruit and things that they grew there. So it was known as a kind of a destination, and it was a way for people to interact when they came out to visit. Additionally, they kept track. I did try to look into the archives of the experimental farm, and they'd been moved several times and people couldn't find them. But in 1980, it was turned into a grain research center run by Monsanto, or funded by Monsanto. So a lot of these records disappeared. But the people worked in teams. They didn't ask to be noted who they were. It would have been on some index cards had I been able to find them. But they developed new crops like triticale, apples that grow in the north, rust-resistant wheat, things that really have benefited many people. And also it was a strong parallel to Luther Burbank's work in California in developing new kinds of plants. Another mysterious image, I find this to be very innovative. It was, remember, all his envelopes are dated. This is 1932, but instead we have an image somewhat like Robert Frank's work, The Americans. There's a man holding a baby behind a car wheel. And so it's sort of contradictory. And we have the reflections of the trees in the car. And the car appears to be moving through a frame, the frame of the photograph. So there's a sense of movement. And it's altogether a very mysterious image, as if it's a film still. It's very, I think, one of his strong images that he created. But the story is opaque. It's hard to find. It's mysterious. And so you look at them and they provoke questions in the mind of the viewer, which is, of course, what really good art is supposed to do. It's supposed to provoke questions rather than just give you a message. One that is more clearly a message, however, is this image of the town post office, which is very iconic. It's the Morden Post Office from 1934. People would meet there when they go to pick up their mail or to mail something. So it's a very iconic place. And today it's the home of the Pembina Hills Arts Center. And there's other buildings around it. But if you can imagine how iconic it was at the time, yet you'll notice Nick's innovations in that he's shooting through wires at it to give some diagonals and some sense of dynamism to this very vertical, sort of stable looking edifice. Another thing he does is he experiments with the use of posture and gesture, which is quite different in the 1930s than it is today. Here we have a group of men in 1933, probably outside the Starland Theater. So again, looking at movie posters, but they have this kind of Rat Pack attitude of, being the guys in the gang. And it's a sort of a freewheeling look. And at the right-hand side, a later photograph of the Starland Theater. So as I mentioned, movies were part of the leisure activities of people in this rural community, and also in Winnipeg. It's very important to them, and even imitating movie stars was kind of an important form of entertainment. He also glamorizes the small town that he came from. Now, by 1938, Nick had become a photographer for the Winnipeg Free Press, and this is in a couple of books, including one by Robert Young. So the photograph at your left is Stephen Street at night. This is the main street of the town, but he's glamorized it by having all these lights. The cameras, the lens is open for a while. The lights become large glowing globes, and you can see that the signs in the town, and it's got a very deep recession in space as well. He plays with the diagonal of the road against the diagonal of the lights in the sky. And a very opposite image on the other side from the day after. It snowed, so it's done quite differently. He documented things that happened. And this really has a Depression era feeling. This is the Millhousen's old meat shop, a fire. From the front view, you see a man walking along. The smoke is billowing out, but at the back, he does a much more dramatic picture in the rear view. There's someone doing firefighting. They're trying to hose off the clouds of smoke that arise, but the focus is the clouds of smoke themselves, the mystery that provides. So you have a very mysterious image, again, that provokes questions. It's not just documentary. It provokes questions about space and movement and the elements. One of Nick's passions was experimenting with photography, and he learned about that on his own. This photograph that we see here was done with a flashlight, and he moved it up and down against the figure as he took the photograph. He played with double exposures, weird lighting, and radical perspectives. He used simple props to create unusual photographs, or he played with posture and gesture. For example, in a double exposure, he'd have to pose the first figure as if they would have their arm around the second figure that he shot in the double exposure. So he tried to pursue the visionary potential of photography to create dreamlike sequences in images. As I mentioned, these anticipate some of the things documented in popular photography in 1937. Here are some of his visual sources. This is just a spread of his magazines. It's a collage from hopefully the book that will come out. These are his images in the center at the right, and it shows his visual sources. One of the titles of the article is Odd Perspectives, and he certainly took that and ran with it. And at the bottom left is a laundry list that he made of things he wanted to buy. In fact, this is it. I went through all of his magazines, of which they must have been 30 or 40 of popular photography and then minicam. And as I was going through them, there were some postcards of foreign countries that came out. So obviously he found those very interesting, or he wouldn't have kept them. And then he had this laundry list of stuff he needed for a darkroom, and it just fell out. And it's written on the back of the cardboard that you fold shirts on, men's shirts, to have in a store, because paper was rare. So all of these things are written on little cards. There were 4 or 5 of them. As well, if you look at the materials, you can see 1938 is on this envelope where he's made a list of what he needs to make lights with, and light stand and single props and things like that. And the one on the left involves creating different filters for the camera. So if I hadn't gone through those, I would never have found that. So it's important to pay attention to these little things, because from that you can create a story. You can build the story, which is Nick's life, because it all tells us about him, including a few letters that I found. Here's a very dramatic photo of Beryl Rabinovitch. She became his favorite model, and of course, she loved to model. That was what she was like, and she looked like Betty Davis, and often played Betty Davis in some plays. And here she's reclining, and her head is in an inverted triangle that's established by the top of her dress. The feet are tiny at the back, and it's very much like surrealist photography of the 1930s, if you look at Bresci or other photographers. So extremely inventive, and it was wonderful that she was only like 3 or 4 years older than him, so she became his best model and a good friend, and I think they like creating these setups together. Here's 2 more double exposures at the right. Beryl again, 2 figures, one with their arm around the other, and he's played with the buttons on her shorts and the tiles on the floor to create very elaborate patterns. These are like a figure and their anima. You know, there's a figure in the anima, the figure and the other part of them. In the one on the left, you have Leon Rabinovitch, who changed his name to Leon Cagney when he had a band of that type. So again, the importance of movie stars in film, with the woman from Winnipeg, Shirley Rice, and that's Beryl moving in the background. But my point is that here he created a scenario in which there's another woman or another figure becoming a force in the background. So he was very attuned to the psychological importance of these images and to the type of story that they could imply. Particularly in this one, which I've thought about. This was given to me by Nick's nephew, Arnold Udell, and his father had kept it in a book. And it's a double exposure of Nick. But I think of him as he had 2 families, so he had 2 different lives, kind of like Leonardo da Vinci, who was given from his mother and had an adoptive mother. Nick had an adoptive mother, Sonia, and he had his own mother, and he had a life with his family in Winnipeg and a life with his family in Morden. So in a sense, I think this kind of tells a story about him. His intent to double things seems to be a reflection on his sense of doubleness, his sense of having other perspectives besides one. And I think he brought this to his later intent to join the forces to fight against fascism during World War II. Now we're moving to the last part of Nick's life. This is the interpenetration of his themes of photography, air flight, and how he became the RAF pilot. And of course, there was a lot of material here, so I'm not going to show all of it, but I'm happy to answer questions about it. These are his attestation papers from 1940. He tried to enlist in 1938 and he was turned back, as he says at the bottom. And then he applied again to become a pilot in the RAF in 1940. But he says, since then, I practiced photography. That's in the lower right. The second page shows that he ranked very highly in everything, but he was put above average and excellent on everything: demeanor, intelligence, appearance. But then at the bottom, he was listed as average, which I find perplexing, but it's still an interesting history. Now, because his body was lost and he never had a funeral, I decided to make a place for him with his family members. So around him is his sister and brother at the far right, my father and his brother at the bottom, and his brother Leon on top, Bill and Ruby on the left. So it's not everyone, but it was a way to create kind of a minion for him, kind of a place, so that he's recognized. Because, as you know, in Judaism, it's important to say that person's name to make them come alive again. And this is one of the things I tried to do with him. He was the lost expressionist. He wasn't known. People suppressed their losses. They didn't talk about anyone who was lost. It was too piercing for them to even attempt. So when I opened the box, there was literally nothing known about him. I had to go around and dig it up, and it became a real fascination for me because I looked at the history of World War II from the perspective of artists who escaped from Paris and Germany and come through Marseille and come to North America, but I hadn't looked at what had happened to people like us Canadian colonials who had gone overseas and what had happened to them. So it allowed me to look at World War II from two different perspectives. Here is a film of Nick and, well, it begins, this is what was happening in World War II, 1939, 1940 in Morden. And it's roughly cropped, but it'll begin with my father and his brother Archie, who was in the dental corps. And then we're actually going to see Nick in his RAF uniform as he'll be walking towards the camera. This is Christmas in the town. These are the RAF officers going out to overseas. This is Nick. Well, I wanted you to get a sense of place and what was going on in the town and how bleak it seemed then. I mean, this would have been in December 1940, right beside 1941. Nick went overseas in the spring of 1942. He trained in Driffield in England and then later was sent to Kabrit in Egypt, where they were sent to numbered stations in order to keep that secret in case the documents were found. And he arrived in Egypt in the October 1942 during the Second Battle of El Alamein, and he served under Field Marshal Montgomery. So I'll tell you a bit more about that once we look at these images. It's interesting in terms of his biography that he was the head of the Model Airplane Association of Manitoba from 1936 on, and he lists that on his attestation papers. And so he did a number of photographs using model airplanes as props. These ones, I think on the left were run by rubber bands, and on the right, it may be a double exposure, or it may be a model airplane, but that's him at the bottom. And the plane is superimposed on that scene, and he's holding his hands up as if he's thrown it up into the air. So it's a really fantastic image, and it foretells his involvement with the RAF. And the other thing, considering his biography, he must have been very good with his spatial intelligence, because to be a pilot, to know where you are, the plane will shift around. You have to know where you are in space. You have to be able to reorient yourself quickly. And he was obviously able to do that. And it's probably one of the things that allowed him to be such a good photographer. He also loved to simply photograph airplanes. This is the wonderment and interest people had at the Stevenson's Airport hangar, the first airport in Winnipeg. And on your right, the photograph of a biplane on the Red River. In August 1940, as I mentioned, Nick enlisted, but he stopped first at his brother's Milton's house in Winnipeg on the way to Shiloh, and he left a note on the back of a photograph of a child. Apparently, he did take his photographs with him. They were that important to him. I'll read you the letter. Milton, you never left the keys, so I had to break in. Anyway, I slept here. We'll leave everything as I found it, and we'll lock the doors again. The train leaves at 8 o'clock, so we'll be gone when you get this. I'm leaving my civvies here, and we'll pick them up later. We'll also pick up the gin later. Expect to return from Shiloh about the 18th of August. If you want to write to me, address your letters, Trooper I.N. Udell, A Squadron, Manitoba Mounted Rifles, Shiloh, Manitoba. Nick. So I love that he said, I'm leaving the gin, but I'll pick that up too. So that was obviously important to them to have a bit of fun. So he enlisted in 1940. So here's one of the things that the type of images that would have confronted him: fly and fight with the RCAF. I'll be with you, boys. Poster advertising the Canadian Mounted Rifles. He was part of the Manitoba Mounted Rifles. So one of the troops around the groups around the Mounties, and this is him in his Mounted Rifles uniform. Their motto was aggressive in attack. It has a bulldog on it, on their little sort of seal that they have. Now, what was very interesting was that as I did my research, I was contacted by a number of people who are on World War II platforms, and one was a British man, Paul Strudd, and his uncle, Ivan Strudd, was Nick's squadron leader and co-pilot. He was the head of, Ivan was the head of Squadron Run 04, and he and Nick were always in the plane together. Ivan was an aristocrat who had gone to Cambridge, well, maybe lower aristocracy, from a military family. And he, once he joined the RAF, he was given the toughest assignments because some of the other officers resented that he had come from this good family. However, Paul provided me with 2 diaries of Ivan's, which gave me the opportunity to create a parallel life story, which we won't go into here, but I'll just mention that he did 2 diaries, one from 1936 and 1938, in which he documents the rise of fascism in Europe. On this one, he says, he's talking about a trip to the continent each time. We were graced with a marvelous day, and after we met Marshall, a friend of mine who had just escaped from Barcelona, the Spanish Civil War, and who gave us a vivid account of the war in Spain, we went on our way to Geneva. We reached Montreux along a road. After touring the town in the car, we pulled up at a garage for petrol. Here I had a long talk with the proprietor, who told me that Hitler was a good chap, and that as long as England and Germany remained good friends, the rest of the world would follow suit. So there's some other pages in his diary where he's totally frightened at the rise of fascism. This is in 1938 during a trip to Germany. But what this did was it gave me an opportunity to look at Nick's life as a colonial, a Canadian sent to the forces, against the life of someone from Britain who had the opportunity to pursue a higher education. Nick's diary was his images. Ivan's was in these documents. So I was able to kind of see what they were doing at the same time. And that, I think, is an interesting part of this story. At Shiloh, Nick was part of the Canadian Forces military training program. Then he became part of the British Commonwealth training program in Brandon and was later sent to Lethbridge for training. And then after that, he traveled by aircraft to England, where he was stationed in Driffield first before being sent to Egypt. He was a pilot in Squadron 104, whose motto was "Strike Hard." And you can see that with the Thunderbolt emblem on the left-hand side. At the time that he was sent over, there were multiple conflicts all around the world. He was sent to the lower part of the Mediterranean here. So first in Egypt, then later Libya. Then he was in Malta flying missions over Tunisia, trying to stop Rommel's supply lines from reaching the Mediterranean. That would have allowed the Nazis to join up with the other Axis forces in Italy. So it was an extremely important and critical mission. However, the airmen were given Vickers Wellington II, which had wood frames and canvas overlay, and they were known as flying coffins. They were slower than the planes that the German had, and they were very dangerous to fly. This is a letter that he died in 1943 in this mission over North Africa, January 6, 1943, to bomb the docks at Sousse, Tunisia, where they could have stopped Rommel's supply lines. But the plane went down in the desert. And here's a letter that my grandfather received.
Hello, Doc. How are you doing in this cruel world? I heard about Nicky. That's tough luck. But there's still a good 50% of a chance that he's alive and well. The Middle East is known for airmen walking home. By the way, how's your wife getting along? Say hello to her and to Milton, will you? Things aren't too bad here. You wouldn't like it. No Pepsi Cola. So long for now. David Monahan.
Oh, so just in terms of the photography that I used here, this came from the Imperial War Museum in London. The image at the left is of an officer stationed in Egypt, and they were beset by sandstorms. There was very little food. It was really quite difficult. So we don't know if Sonia's packages ever reached him there because of the secret numbered locations and such like. It would have taken time. It might have been moved. The image at the right is of German flak, and on it is a letter written by the father of one of the 7 airmen who perished in the crash. As the plane went down, it was hit by German flak. It was Flight F for Freddie. It's in the operations handbook, which I'm not going to show you, but I was able to look at all these documents because Paul Strett shared with me what he had found. He was seeking their graves in Tunisia, which were never found, but they are listed on the Malta War Memorial. So that last letter was read by my brother, David Rabinovitch. This next one is read by Nicholas Rice, an actor cousin in Toronto.
I regret to note from your letter re my son, Geoffrey A. O'Keefe, that you have abandoned hope of his being alive. A letter has been received from Major Stratt, the father of the captain of the bomber, whose body was one of those found. He expresses the opinion that his son ordered the others to bail out, while he and another, Nick Udell, tried to land the machine. Under the circumstances, although I have received no further news of my son other than the above, I am loath to abandon all hope of his still being alive. I've heard that the aircraft was burned. Is this correct? Yours faithfully, A.S. O'Keefe.
I'm going to conclude this talk by just mentioning that Nick was given a number of awards, the 1939 45 Star, Africa Star and Bar, the Defense Medal, Canadian Volunteer Service Medal and Clasp and War Medal 1939-45. He was posthumously awarded the RCAF Operational Wings in 1946 in recognition of gallant service in action against the enemy. The Malta Memorial, the Morden Cenotaph, Canada's Book of Remembrance, and Udell Lake in northern Manitoba bear his name. Having lived only until 26, Nick offers us a prism of his life through his images. These images recall a time where exchange was not defined by money. This principle is common to many cultures, from the Judeo-Christian covenant, where each relationship reflects the relationship with the sacred, to the Buddhist compassion that finds an energetic connection between sentient beings. Discovering links between Nick's images, we uncover how rich his life was, how rich each life is. Looking at his work seems like looking into the Aleph, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, that has no sound, but that exhales the breath that forms the world. Nick's breath and his world is in these images. Thank you. Now I'll open up to questions. We could have questions. I can stop the screen sharing. Stan, who's going to handle the questions here? You need your sound on. Okay. So I'm happy to answer any questions if people have them. Stan, are you going to?
Let's see, there aren't any so far.
Okay. Paul, do you have some questions?
I just want to congratulate you. What an informative and insightful presentation. It's been wonderful. And I'm so glad we all had the opportunity to learn about this, otherwise, as you said, forgotten individual who deserves to be remembered. And I can't imagine the work that must have gone into bringing this person back to life. Thank you so much, Celia.
Thank you, Paul. It's wonderful. Okay, there's a comment from Terry Cherniak, a beautiful tribute to an extraordinary artist. Yes, I do think Nick was an extraordinary artist, and I think it was an extraordinary time. And that's why I want to document it, because it helped me understand. My father was born in 1909. I mean, I had older parents, and it helped me understand them. And it helped me understand what they lived through during the Depression. Now, here's a question. Did Nick ever use color film, or was it just that all good photographers only use black and white? I don't think color film was available to him then. I don't think it was available. The often photographs from that time period appear to be hand colored. Okay, and someone is asking, will the recording be available for others? Yes, I believe so. I think it's going to be on the Jewish Heritage of Western Canada website. Yeah, on their YouTube channel. Yeah. Thank you, Stephanie. Oh, it looks like there's a few more questions happening. No, not yet. Well, maybe Belle or Stan, you have a few questions. Stan's very familiar with the project. He's one of the first people who supported it.
Yeah.
And I'm very grateful.
Excellent project.
Now, Harlan, did you have some questions?
No questions on my end. It's just incredible how you're able to tell his story through all these photos. Like you're following along. It's obviously not a day by day, but it almost feels like it's a day by day story that you're telling of him. So incredible, really.
Well, it's a diary. It's a visual diary of his life. I'm just going to mention for those who are interested, I had to cross-reference multiple modes of exploration. For example, visual anthropology, the use of posture and gesture. Here's a few more questions here. I had to use art history because obviously he'd absorbed whatever he'd seen. I had to cross-reference my father's movies with his photographs and the diaries of Paul Strutt with Nick's images to become, to try to build their world. Let me see. Someone said, born in Manitoba in 1928, knew your father. Grateful for your research about Udell. What a wonderful person. That's nice. Now, here's a question from Fred Switzer. Do we know much of the early camera equipment film stock, especially when he was 12, that allowed such wonderful imaging and thoughtfulness and creativity? Well, I know that later he took his film to be processed to the drugstore across the street in Morden. And the film is still in some of the envelopes there. And I know that he had a Brownie camera, but I haven't been able, despite talking with experts like Elaine Halpert, who I think is listening, to find out exactly what the camera was. We have samples of those kinds of cameras. So the film stock was always Kodak, just so you know. And the camera equipment, he didn't have a lot of money. He built his own equipment. He had built lights with sort of reflectors on them that my father had kept. And he had plans for a dark room, and I'm sure he actually built it. But we don't have a lot of that left. Yeah. Okay, here's another question from Gail Switzer. Were self-portraits common at the time? Were cameras set up for it? No, I don't think so. There's not many self-portraits. I mean, you have a portraitist like Man Ray, a surrealist artist originally from Philadelphia. His name was actually Emanuel Raditsky, and he did some self-portraits with changing lighting and things like that. He was a little bit older than Nick, but no, you don't find a lot of self-portraits. It's very unusual. And what I think is remarkable is that they're so different from today's selfie, where people try to glamorize themselves and have the non-expressive face. And he has a very, wonderfully and subtly expressive face. So thank you for that question. That's very useful. Any other questions? Okay, I see my cousin Alex Mobile was watching it. Oh, Ihor Helbisky, self-portraits date to 1900. I guess I stand corrected. Thank you. But I don't think there's many from Western Canada. That's the thing. So, any other questions from the panelists? So. Well, I want to thank everyone for attending and for giving me the support to do this, particularly Stan Carbone and Bel Jarniski and the Jewish Heritage Center of Western Canada and the Switzer family in particular. And I hope it gave you some insights about your own family and how things were kind of rock and roll. People created a good exchange in that time period. And I think it's a wonderful example for our own time period. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Celia,
Celia.
for
Go ahead.
any more comments?
I think maybe there is one or two more. Color photography dates to 1904. That's also Ihor Helbisky, good colleague of mine. Thank you. The question was this a personally satisfying experience, allowing you to learn more about your family? Yes, absolutely, it was satisfying. It's been hard promoting it. That's the hard part. But yes, it was satisfying, and it allowed me to answer certain questions about my father's life and why he had such a compassionate attitude to people. I mean, I think it was wonderful the way people from that era could create an exchange with anyone. And that's what I meant about the exchange. Also, the exchange being the covenant, that exchange doesn't have to do with gaining anything because the exchange is more than the sum of its parts. And you see that Nick did that when he took photographs of people. I mean, that is one of the principles behind this project. He did that when he took photographs of people. He did that in his friendships. So thank you for that question too. And then Igor says, yes, there weren't many self-portraits from Western Canada. That's probably why I answered that way. Thank you. And then Fred Switzer was asking, where does the inspiration come from when he was so young? I think that family in itself, the Rabinovitch family, and I'm talking about, they were much older. I didn't know a lot of my aunts and uncles very well. They had a lot of curiosity. I think that was it. It was curiosity and interest in documenting what you had around you. And I think the fact that he had two families and to be, was moving up and back, that made him want to kind of ground himself by using the camera. So great question. And since there's no other questions, I'll end here. But thank you, everyone, for attending and supporting me and for your interest. Thank you.
Thank you, Celia. Thank you for an excellent presentation in which you were able to frame Nick's intellect and artistry in the context of the social, cultural, and historical forces that shaped his life and perception of his environment. And by bringing his photographs to life and by sharing with us the people that were part of his milieu and influenced his artistic sensibilities, you also remind us of how rich and varied the Western Canadian Jewish historical experience is. I think it's also fair to say that Nick gave more than a modernist and cosmopolitan aura. And it shows through the photographs and through the personalities that really come at you through the presentation, and also with the interest that you've given to this project and the passion that you brought to it. Thank you very much for a wonderful evening. Looking forward to your participation in our future programs. And thank you, Celia, again for a great presentation.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.